So I'd like to thank all our corporate speakers, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. So could we go to our next slides? So we'll talk about artificial intelligence and its impact in retina. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Darius Moshfeghi from Stanford here, who has presented already, Dr. Gilad Kish from Weill Cornell, and then Dr. Nitin Chaudhary from Toronto. All three of these are superb clinicians that are also involved in the AI space. And I think it'll give you an idea of how we as clinicians look at artificial intelligence going forward to give potentially some insight to you. So, guys, and it's only guys, sadly enough, is artificial intelligence in retina here to stay?
Yes. Yes, Tim, I think it is.
Yeah, I agree. I think it seems like it's integrating within our devices, so it's definitely going to be a mainstay.
Yeah, absolutely. We have so much data that's coming down the pike that the only way to really efficiently deal with it is to use artificial intelligence.
So Darius, with the first FDA-approved integrated artificial intelligence package in retina, why do you think there's been such a delay in its impact?
Well, I think that people got enamored with the technology and weren't focusing necessarily on the customer, where your application is going to be. And I think that's vitally important. When I saw the lectures up here, they kind of fell into two broad categories. One was large corporations or startups focusing on improving efficiency or processes or streamlining things, and then the other side, our side, which is like focusing on a business for commercial interests. And when you're focusing on a business, you really have to focus on who your customer is and what your exit strategy is going to be.
We've seen sort of a huge sort of increase in the academic focus on artificial intelligence over the last 10 years. If you look at PubMed for Medline researches, we've had almost as many publications in the last 6 months than we had in the last 6 years. So is the timeline accelerating for AI and Retina?
Tim, I think the problem with the uptake is monetization. And I can give you an example. In our clinics, we have 5 Optos devices in various endocrinology clinics, primary care clinics. And when that metric was removed, it was hard to get the primary care doc to take a picture to begin with. And now it's even harder because the question is, who pays for it? Who is your customer? I think that in some ways it is a zero-sum game, and I know companies are saying that they're going to keep the doctor within the game, but at some point, part of our work is going to be made different. And I think in order to realize what that difference is and how to continue the compensation model, that's the challenge. It's not the technology.
But isn't that what disruptive technologies do routinely? So, I mean, isn't it imperative, one, to understand what the advance of the technology brings to the field, but then how to incorporate it? I look at all of our practices. We're extremely busy. We're talking about a burden of care load that going forward. I don't see this replacing me at all. In fact, I see this as focusing the patients that I'm going to see to those patients that really need to be in my office, potentially supplanting, the need for comprehensive ophthalmologic review.
But there's a comprehensive ophthalmologist that you're supplanting. Right.
Well, we're going to see changes. For example, when Optos launched in my community, which is a wide field imaging platform, it really launched in the optometric community. It didn't launch in ophthalmology. And I was getting referrals right and left. I mean, I had 5 referrals in 1 week for melanoma, which was the thumb of the person taking the picture. I got to see a lot of thumbs for a while. It was kind of cool. So, it's wonderful to have outstanding imaging technology, but interpretation is really what is the bread and butter of the field of retina. So having that expand outward so that interpretation improves significantly, I see that as a big plus. It's when we were all training, you got an EKG and you read the EKG. There's no EKG platform now that doesn't come up with interpretive analysis of the EKG. Doesn't mean you're going to agree with it, but it's there. And I think most of the doctors coming out would be shocked to look at an EKG that didn't have initial interpretation.
So I think, yeah, to tough to what you're saying. I think the technology started out as, can we do this? And it ended up in the screening space, which is still growing. And there's obviously a great need for that, particularly in certain key populations, as we saw earlier. But taking it into the hands of the physicians in the office is, where does it fit in? We've already screened them. I want to see who needs to be seen by me. And then can you strip out the salient features of all the data volume, as was presented with the Zeiss talk, that will help me fine-tune my practice to be more efficient, but at the same time triage patients within the practice as to where they should go. I think if we can take this into the clinical trial space, as was presented earlier also, with respect to the Tracy talk, is can we then find key biomarkers to put people in the right trials for the right purpose? So I think that's the general spectrum that hopefully we can see evolve through discussions like this.
So Tim, in our practice, we have residents, fellows, medical students, assistants, what have you, and we're managing them. AI is going to be another thing we're going to be managing. Our job as experienced clinicians is to look for where the opportunity is going to be next.
One of the things that bothers me a little bit in some of the artificial intelligence in retina is the lack of really retina being involved. So, Dr. Keish, comment on maybe Google's project going forward. There's been some concerns about who's involved in helping them identify what is, warranted for referral, what is appropriate for an urgent referral, a semi-urgent referral, what doesn't require referral. To me, a big component of AI is going to be the devil in the detail of what does it tell us and what do we do with it.
Well, I think you can view Optos and Google, or I guess Nikon is now Optos' parent, and Verily, the healthcare arm of Google, that collaboration to be somewhat ideal. They take a set of images that are graded by professional graders, multiple professional graders, graders that are used in clinical trials, and that becomes the gold standard. If there's a disagreement between those graders, then there's a third grader who actually goes in and adjudicates. And so there, at least what we think of as a gold standard is being set. Old data sets that were graded by your resident du jour may have lacked that rigor. And so I think getting the retina specialists involved at that point and saying, do you agree with the graders? And what would you do? I think we're evolving not only in how you diagnose, but what the meaning is in the context of how we treat patients. So I think getting physicians involved and having a buy-in to say this is something different, it's not that you're no longer needed, but you're going to be needed in a different way, is definitely key.
We focused a little bit on sort of primarily focused macular imaging versus wide field imaging. Darius, what's your comment on how important it is to look broadly at the retina versus in a very focused manner?
Well, in the pediatric retina space, it's key. We're looking for any pathology that we can be actionable. For diabetes, you're looking for a threshold where you're going to have an actionable item, where you're going to treat for vitreous hemorrhage, proliferative diabetic retinopathy, or macular edema. But I think the more of the retina that you can see and evaluate, the better and more informed your decision-making process can be. And then that leads towards how streamlined you can be with respect to your referrals.
So I'd like some insight on monetization, because I think that's important. I think many of us have a huge interest, for example, in OCTA. But the question is, how do you monetize that instrumentation in your office and in your practice? So you're talking about screening 4 million babies in a way that has not been done before. So where does that impact in terms of monetization? How does that get paid for? Is that a public health policy issue?
So initially, you start off how we did with hearing screening. They started off with cash pay. And in a select population, they collected enough data to show that it had societal benefit, identifying children early on. The reason that their hit rate isn't high enough is because it's neuroprogressive. If you screen them later in the age process, you get a higher positivity. High-risk families will have 5%, whereas the general population will only come in at 0.1 to 0.6%. That isn't the case in ophthalmology. 98, 99% of the pathology is present at birth. Very few, like the RPE65, will show up later over time. And so for us, there's a lot of benefit in screening very early, and then you make the referral, and people are going to say, well, that's just a birth hemorrhage. We're going to ignore that birth hemorrhage, but what about the foveal hemorrhage? Or what about the multilaminar hemorrhages? What about the retinoblastoma, fever, X-linked retinoschisis, congenital cataracts, glaucomas, whatever you have? And the list goes on and on and on. And we have hundreds of thousands of images in our database and tens of thousands, nearly 100,000 patients.
Well, to me, it always comes down to you don't see what you don't look for. So
that's exactly correct.
I'm old enough to have been at Bascom Palmer pre-OCT technology, and there was a lot of pushback from some of the doctors there to say, we don't need OCT, we're Bascom Palmer. And I think, in fact, the minute the OCT stepped in the door, it was like, oh my God, what have we been doing? So I think it allowed people to elevate their quality of care broadly. So to me, that when technology can step forward like that, that's huge. So you're right. I think that people don't know what they're looking at or know what it means. But if you don't look at it, you're not going to be able to measure it. You can't learn from it, and you won't know what needs to be treated.
I think one thing we're also starting to see is that there are subgroups of disease states like neurodegenerative disorders, MS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, etc., where there are biomarkers within the retina that none of us have been able to pick up clinically prior to this point. And I think that's another way that the payer may get involved, or insurance companies may get involved in paying for the cost of certain testing to help screen and augment the trajectory of those patients through the system as they go on.
I mean, Tim, getting sort of down to the depths of monetization, I think Darius has got an incredible company that fills a niche where there's a shortage of pediatric ophthalmologists or retina specialists to do the screening. You know, in Manhattan, we have 5 healthcare systems. You throw a nickel, you're going to hit 3 retina specialists. And so we're not fighting over patients, but there's going to be a change in your compensation. If an AI algorithm comes in and that picture is taken and the patient doesn't necessarily have to come into your office, but even before then, who's going to buy the Optos machine, right? So who's going to lay out that 25, 30, 40, 50,000? And then when that image is read by the AI algorithm, who's going to pay for that image to be read? You know, is it going to be the healthcare system, the primary care physician, society? And I think those need to be sorted out so that there is an ROI with a huge investment like AI.
Right.
So as a real quick follow-up to that, you know, one of the problems with screening for diabetes or macular degeneration, glaucoma, or what have you, is that you're screening, and at the end of the day, there's no mandate to screen these patients, which means there's no reimbursement mechanism. And then finally, even if you do find something, there's no guarantee that that patient's going to get treated. However, different in a pediatric population, we highly prize babies being able to see, you know, little Johnny, little Susan being born, and you want them to see, and you're going to get that child into the healthcare system and evaluated, which is helping serve as a wedge for reimbursement and then ultimately, you know, for some form of government mandate.
So my take-home message for all of you in the last minute and a half that we have is that I think artificial intelligence in ophthalmology, and particularly in retina, is clearly here to stay, right? And that it's going to become a component of pretty much every major imaging platform going forward. I don't imagine going forward that 5 years from now, we're not going to see an AI integrated into whatever imaging system we're utilizing. And finally, I hope everyone realizes that having, like you know for everything you do, that the right people at the right time make all the difference. So I'm hoping that we have key input going forward on what the clinical parameters are to artificial intelligence in retina. And with that, I'd like to thank all of my panelists, my corporate speakers. I'd like to thank all of you. Hopefully you are as excited about artificial intelligence as I am. Hopefully we're not as fearful as Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking. I don't see it going that way, but you never know. So I look forward to seeing where we are 3 years from now. Thank you.